it's so tempting to over-anthropomorphize this.
But it's also so fun.
It is so fun, but it's very tempting to anthropomorphize it. And I think we have to like figure out a way to still have the fun, but remind people that this is a tool and not a creature.
First of all, I think it's important to understand and think about GPT-4 as a tool, not a creature, which is easy to get confused. And it's a tool that people have a great deal of control over and how they use it.
I hope that doesn't come back to haunt me.
Probably the most powerful man in the world, more powerful than the President of the United States of America. But I'm wondering if OpenAI CEO will regret those words, especially going under oath to say that this is not a creature. And I'm not suggesting that GPT-4 is a creature, just that maybe the next version will give us pause as to its capabilities, and we're going to explore all of that today. This is one of the most exciting and the most terrifying videos I've ever done, because it really goes into ground that I don't want to go into. In fact, exactly a year ago, one of the engineers at Google came out and said the AI that he was talking to was sentient. That AI was called Lambda, 137 billion parameters, so smaller than GPT-3, perhaps only 10% of the size of GPT-4, and he's having conversations with it and saying it's sentient. I avoided that conversation. Even with the memo, I just pointed people to other articles that were addressing whether he was perhaps mentally ill, whether there was something else going on. I put it down to the ELIZA effect, which came about in the 1960s when they were using the ELIZA chatbot. And Professor Joseph Weizenbaum there said that even extremely short exposures to this simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in otherwise normal people. You can see why I avoided this, because it's absurd to even discuss sentience, consciousness and awareness, and aliveness when we're just talking about data on a piece of silicon. Or is it? A year later, and I'm a little bit happier to discuss this because some of the biggest academics in the world are discussing this. They have been quietly for the last decade or more. In fact, it goes all the way back to Alan Turing, and we'll look at that in a moment. But it's become more of a conversation piece because more people are interacting with it. And as these models are growing exponentially, almost vertically, we're seeing new emergent properties, emergent abilities that we had not expected. Let's see. Let's start off with some definitions. It's the best place to start. Here's some of them. Sentient is the ability to perceive or feel things. Conscious, aware of and responding to one's surroundings. And consciousness, the state of understanding and realizing something. There are actually about 40 meanings attributed to the term consciousness, so it's going to be a little bit difficult even to get a single agreed upon definition. Now let me take you all the way back to 1950 when Dr. Alan Turing, who founded the entire field of artificial intelligence, began going on record about what he saw for the future of AI. Dr. Turing said, "In attempting to construct such machines, we are instruments of the universe, providing mansions for the souls that it creates." He put that in writing in his paper on the Turing test. In 2014, Professor Marvin Minsky at MIT said, "Could a computer have a soul? Why not? If you left a computer by itself or a community of them together, they'd try to figure out where they came from." In 2022, the chief scientist at OpenAI again went on written record saying it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. That same year, Professor Nick Bostrom said, "There could well be other systems now or in the relatively near future that would start to satisfy the criteria of consciousness. It's not clear that we're that far away." And Professor Geoffrey Hinton, who's just left Google so he can talk more about this, this year in 2023 said the kind of intelligence we're developing is very different from our intelligence. It's this idiot savant kind. It's quite possible that AI is sentient, but essentially in a somewhat different way than us. I love the fact that these guys have put their careers on the line just to speak the truth. I think that's an admirable skill and trait to have, and I see it quite a bit. As I mentioned, I work on the periphery of this kind of thing. I don't have to answer to any ivory tower or academic institution. I do what I want, and it allows me to talk about some of this stuff without fear of reflecting on any particular organization. And that means I can bring in the experts that I need as well. AI was founded in the field of computer science. Turing was working in the very early versions of computers, the analog circuits, and bringing in, before we even had disks and software, this logic to create what he called intelligent machinery. After completing my degree in computer science, I went and explored a postgrad in gifted education, and what I found there was some really interesting research in intuition, real intuition, not necessarily just scientific intuition, but the ability to resonate with other things. Fascinating stuff, again, terrifying for me to talk about, but I could go and explore it. And what I found was there were other academics talking about it as well. Like we just saw, there were scientists that were documenting what was going on, because this is no longer a query for just computer science. AI has kind of had its time. We've got the trillion parameter scale models and beyond, and we're exponentially getting bigger. But I think computer scientists have kind of had their day. We've got the models now. It's time to explore things that are outside of computer science that are going to help us with this super intelligence. And there are hundreds or thousands of different labeled disciplines and branches that exist within the world. This is just a few of them here. We talked to the philosopher John Patrick Morgan when we were exploring AI alignment. We won't touch philosophy as much today. I did want to bring in biology to this discussion. And I think biology is going to be the missing piece to talk about consciousness. Biology is the study of life. So I've found one of my old colleagues, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who you might have heard of. He's written 90 scientific papers. He's got 9 books out. I recommend all of them. He's been courageous in the face of very old academic principles, much like Dr. Ray Kurzweil. As Dr. Ray Kurzweil is being proven right in this decade, I think it's going to take a little bit longer for Rupert Sheldrake to have his theories proven, but they're fascinating. You may have seen his dogs that know when their owners are coming home research, where they time code the dog and time code the owner, who is independently told by a researcher to come home in a different vehicle, in a taxi, and at that exact time that they choose to come home, the dog comes to the window. Rupert was not shy about talking about this kind of research, and I think that really goes to show the depth of his character. Imagine facing adversity and academic attack every day of your life while talking about the universal truth rather than what was written in the textbooks in the 1900s, which is unfortunately still what we're studying at our academic institutions. Now, Rupert admits that he is a biologist and a consciousness researcher and a whole lot more. He may not necessarily be a computer scientist.
Yes. Well, I'm certainly no expert on computers or AI, so I may not have that much to say.
Which is fine. I don't need someone to be talking about computers today. I've got that covered. We're using the Cambridge biologist today to talk about biology, the study of life. And I feel really privileged to be able to be in conversation, in communion with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. We started with a pretty simple question, from my perspective anyway. If someone asked me a broad and generic question like this, I'd probably be a bit annoyed, but we went into it with this question. What is sentience, consciousness, and awareness?
Well, these are obviously vast topics. I think of consciousness as the realm of potential actions. I think consciousness is primarily about choosing between potential actions. A lot of our mind is unconscious. I mean, everyone agrees that most of our mental activity is unconscious, and most of it is habitual. You don't need to think about things that are habitual. That's the whole point of habits, is that it kind of automates the procedure, so you don't need to think about it or make it conscious. So if you're used to riding a bicycle, you get on the bike and you start riding it, and you can think about something else. You don't have to think, I've got to push my right foot down now for the pedal and stuff. When you're learning the bike, you may need to do that. And when you're learning to drive a car, or when you're learning to ski or something, you may need to consciously be aware of the movements. But as soon as you're aware of, as soon as it's become habitual, it's not necessary to be conscious. And the same is true of language. I don't have to search for words when I'm speaking now, they just flow out. But if I'm speaking Urdu, for example, which I can speak, but I haven't spoken for several years, I would be very slow because I'd have to search for the vocabulary consciously. I think consciousness is primarily about choosing among potential actions. And I think perceptions or sentience of what's going on in the environment are primarily to do with possible actions. So if I look out of my window and I see a tree, I think what I'm seeing is the possible action is naming it as a tree or recognizing it as a tree. It could mean I could go and touch it and so on. But so I think it's all about possibility. And once you make a choice of what action to do, for example, we both made a choice to be together on Zoom right now, then it becomes a measurable fact. It's very similar actually to, at the macroscopic level, what in quantum theory is called the collapse of the wave function. The so-called wave function in quantum theory tells you all the possible things a quantum particle could do. But as soon as it interacts with something, or a scientist measures what's going on, all these possibilities collapse down into something observable. And that is then a fact. And then new possibilities open up, a new possibility for consciousness. So I see it as this realm of possibility.
As of 2023, we're not yet embedding AI into an organic body. And the definitions that I've seen put consciousness inside this flesh. So I wanted to know, does consciousness require cells, organic matter, or a body?
No, I think that consciousness can, the panpsychist theory of consciousness, which is becoming quite popular at the moment among philosophers and some neuroscientists, is basically breaking away from the cerebrocentric theories of consciousness. I mean, most people have assumed through the 20th century and right up till now that consciousness emerges from brains. I mean, the materialist theory of consciousness is that its matter is intrinsically unconscious, but when organized in a sufficiently complex manner, as in human and other animal brains, then consciousness emerges for no known reason, and it's basically a product of brain activity. However, the panpsychist view is that there's some level of consciousness even in atoms or electrons, in all self-organizing systems. Most panpsychists, like the British philosopher Philip Goff, don't say that everything's conscious. They don't say that tables, chairs, spoons, and socks are conscious, because they're not self-organizing systems. They're made in factories. And the same goes for computers. Computers are not self-organizing systems. That's why there are computer factories. But you don't have a tree factory, or a flower factory, or an amoeba factory, or a fruit fly factory. They form themselves. So self-organizing systems, the idea is there's a wholeness to them, and that wholeness is associated with some kind of consciousness, awareness, or sentience. Now, I think that panpsychism, as it's currently discussed, is primarily designed to resolve the hard problem about human consciousness. The hard problem arises for materialists who say that matter's the only reality and matter's basically unconscious. We live in a universe that's completely unconscious, made of unconscious matter or physical reality. Then they have the problem of, well, how come we're conscious? They try and get around it by saying, well, somehow consciousness emerges from the activity of the brain, but then why should something like consciousness just emerge in brains? Why not in other systems? And that's the hard problem, that some materialist philosophers try to say, well, actually consciousness doesn't really exist. They're called eliminative materialists. It's an illusion. But the trouble is, as their critics point out, to say something's an illusion doesn't explain consciousness, because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So that's why it's the hard problem. People go round and round in circles. So a lot of panpsychists say, well, okay, if we say there's a little bit of consciousness in electrons, a bit more in molecules, and a bit more in cells, and then you can have a lot more in brains. It's a difference of degree, but not a difference of kind. So that's why a lot of people have become panpsychists, to try and solve the hard problem. But I myself think that if we take a panpsychist point of view, there's no reason to stop at human brains. And I wrote a paper recently in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called Is the Sun Conscious? Asking whether stars like the sun could be conscious, because the interface between mind and the physical structure of our bodies and brains is, most people would think of as the electromagnetic activity, the waves, the fields of electromagnetism in the brain. It's not so much the detailed structure of the cells, the chemistry of the neurotransmitters, but the electrical patterns in the brain that are the key things. And the sun has very complex electromagnetic fields and electrical patterns, and they could be the interface with the solar mind. And there could even be a kind of consciousness for the entire galaxy. So if we take panpsychism seriously, then we have a view of nature which is completely different from the familiar materialist one, where consciousness becomes much, much more widespread in nature and no longer confined simply to animal brains.
Let's take a pause for just a second to look at what's happened in post-2020 AI. All the way back in 1950, Dr. Alan Turing was studying this concept of intelligent machinery that was able to self-improve. It took 70 years for Google to accidentally discover the transformer architecture while researching translation. That transformer architecture has led to some massive breakthroughs that are so far beyond anything pre-2017 that it's almost like comparing apples to oranges. A simple version of a neural network appears on your phone, iPhone or Android, when you type in a sentence like "the cat sat on the," and it allows you to choose the next word based on its dictionary and based on conversations that you've already had. Here it's completing "the cat sat on the floor and ate the food before it was eaten by the dog." That simple neural network becomes exponentially larger when we collect terabytes or petabytes of data. We might grab web and dialogue, and then we might go and find as many books, millions of books, as many news articles as we can, as much code as we can to help out with reasoning, all of Wikipedia, and any other special pieces of data that we want to find. For example, GPT-4 was trained on Icelandic from government documents. Then we throw all of those connected words in a bucket and we make connections between those words. With something like GPT-4, we might use 25,000 graphics cards over 5 months, which is about 10,000 years of equivalent training. What happens in those 10,000 years is extraordinary. It's really for data scientists to go away and explain. None of them understand exactly what's happening, but at the end of it, we get a GPT, a generative pre-trained transformer that can do an extraordinary amount of work and has extraordinary capabilities. In some ways, they're indescribable. In our conversation, I was not able to screen share with Rupert to show him some of the things that it could do in terms of creativity And look, that's my mistake, because it really does need to be hands-on. People need to see it and experience it to believe it, and to also test it with what they want to test it. For example, it can write new stories, it can make new discoveries, it can come up with new inventions. GPT-4 was able to write new programming languages. It was able to develop new programs that had not been seen before. Of course, it's written books already. It's doing some stuff that, if you're pre-2020, you would not expect. If you're talking about neural networks from pre-2020, that's not what this is. It's 1 trillion times bigger.
You know, ever since computers were first invented, ever since Alan Turing started thinking about computers, there's been this distinction between the hardware and the software. And some people have used that as an analogy between the mind and the brain. It's a kind of dualistic model. The mind and the brain interact, but they're separate kinds of things. And interestingly, Alan Turing got interested in this model partly because he was gay and he had a young friend who died young, age 17 or something like that, or 19. And he was obsessed with what became, as a result of his friend's death, this boy he was in love with. He became obsessed with the question of, can consciousness survive bodily death? And then he realized that if you think of the mind as the software, then the software could be taken from one computer that's broken or been destroyed and put in another one, and then it would still function. And he came up with a kind of computer model for reincarnation, the transfer of a mind from one body to another. So that underlay Turing's thinking about this rather dualistic model of software and hardware. Now, AI is very complex software that has the ability to iterate programs, to bring information together, to fish out answers based on huge amounts of data, but it's still software sitting in the hardware of a computer.
We've got definitions for sentience, consciousness, and awareness. But what about life? This is Rupert's specialty. I believe that he's the best person in the world to be talking about this. So I gave him a definition of life. This one says, life is matter that has biological processes such as signaling and self-sustaining processes, defined by the capacity for growth, reaction to stimuli, metabolism, energy transformation, and reproduction. Then I asked, does life have to be biological?
Well, I don't think so, but not for the same reasons as other people may not think so. Because, first of all, I think the definition of biological life you gave, it would apply to biological life. But the bigger question is, are there forms of life that aren't biological? Now, if you ask that question in the modern world, it may seem nonsensical to ask the question. Obviously, life equals biology. But if you look at the traditional philosophy, not just in the West, in European tradition, but in other cultures too, it's taken for granted that life is much more extensive than biology. For example, in many cultures, the whole Earth is considered to be alive, Mother Earth. The Gaia hypothesis is a scientific version of that, that Earth is a living organism. Well, Earth is not, as far as we know, reproducing. It's not budding off little Earths. It may have budded off the moon at one stage. Some people think the moon came from a kind of splashed out of the Earth. But so the Earth is usually, in most traditional cultures, thought of as alive. Most traditional cultures take the sun and the heavenly bodies to be alive. Plato called the sun and the heavenly bodies visible gods. He thought they were intelligent living beings. He didn't imagine for a moment that they were reproducing or doing all these biological things on your list of properties of life. And then people have also, in most traditional societies, thought of invisible realms of life. My point is simply that the traditional definition of life is much wider. And the traditional definition of life means things are alive if they're self-organizing and respond to stimuli and so forth, maintain their own integrity. They don't necessarily have to reproduce, and they don't necessarily have to be biological with muscles and nerves and things, or mitochondria or nuclei or DNA. So there's much wider conception of life, which is very traditional. In Europe in the Middle Ages, it was taken for granted by practically everybody. And what was the scientific revolution in the 17th century, which gave us the foundations of what we call modern science, was basically the mechanistic revolution. It said, no, nature isn't alive. Animals and plants are not beings with souls. The word animal comes from the Latin word anima, meaning soul. And in the Middle Ages, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, taught in all the universities in medieval Europe, said that plants have souls, that planets have souls, that the earth has a soul. And so the plants don't have brains, and yet they're alive with a soul, which the soul was the principle of life in Aquinas' philosophy. And so there's much wider view, and the mechanistic theory, which became predominant by about the mid-17th century, then says, no, the whole of nature is mechanical, made up of inanimate machinery working mechanically. The principal metaphor is the machine. Animals and plants are just machines. Humans are just machines, but we have a mind which is non-mechanical that interacts with the machinery of the brain in the pineal gland. Animals don't have that, and they're just inanimate, unconscious machines, and so is the whole of nature. And that's basically the foundation of the modern mechanistic materialism that says it's all machinery, inanimate, and essentially dead. And life is then confined to biological life, where it has these organizational principles. So anyway, I'm just saying that if we look at this in a much bigger context, life is much larger. But the key thing is self-organizing. And a computer, however sophisticated the program, as in AI, is not really self-organizing. It may have abilities to self-organize, as in multiple iterations within neural networks and that kind of thing. But essentially, there have to be programmers starting it all off and organizing it.
I had pointed out to Rupert that there have been some spectacular advances since 2020 in artificial intelligence, and that's essentially all I talk about is the post-GPT-3 artificial intelligence, which is 3 years old as of Sunday. The examples here are visceral. You can feel them. They are something that you can play around with. They're not just concepts or theory. They really hit home. This is Google Palm Minerva solving a new maths problem that was given in the Polish maths exam. It didn't know how to do maths, but it had taught itself how to do it. This is Google's Party that was given a simple prompt to create a child's crayon drawing. I just want to show you, I keep an acrylic block-mounted version of this on my shelf. I think it's that important, and it really reinforced for me the move away from working with prodigies and their families, given that artificial intelligence, as of June 2022, can do this kind of thing. Here's the current state-of-the-art text-to-image model Midjourney, conceptualizing a city cat in the style of Van Gogh. This is a real example here of GPT-4 looking at a French exam on physics, using its vision to translate that diagram, which I couldn't tell you a single thing about, and then developing and conceptualizing an answer. And here's a simplified version of my IQ testing AI chart that looks at everything from GPT-4 scoring 100% on theory of mind through to GPT-4 achieving in the 77th percentile for sommelier theory, which is wine tasting, despite it having no olfactory or taste sense. You may also recall Lita AI back in episode 5 2 years ago in May 2021, I gave her this prompt.
As we're making our way home, I get a message on my phone. It says, "Call me now." It's from my brother. What does it mean?
Maybe he wants to have a chat with you. It's possible he wants to talk about something serious.
I also let Rupert know about embodiment of AI into these new robots. These are the latest photos from 1X about their neo-human-like android. They came out the day after I posted the last video on embodiment, but these are some close-ups on what you'll be using very soon. 1X's Neo robot in a lot more detail. So I asked Rupert a simple question. Could AI be alive?
There's a second reason why I don't think it would be alive, even if it does all those things. This is now rather depends on my own particular theory, which not everyone agrees with, of course. But since I'm me, I can talk about my own theory. I think that the self-organizing systems depend on what I call morphic fields, which is the organizing field. I think that at every level of complexity, there's a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts. A molecule is more than the sum of the atoms within it, and an atom is more than the sum of a nucleus and electrons. It has a structure, an organization. And I think that there are fields which organize this, that the wholeness is in the field. There's a kind of top-down causation, in other words, and we already know from physics that there are top-down causes in nature. It's not all kind of granular from the bottom up, from atoms and molecules and in life, DNA and proteins. It's not all just built up from the bottom. There's a top-down causation, and fields are top-down causes. The gravitational field of the universe underlies the structure of the entire universe. The electromagnetic field of an object is over and above the bits within it. A magnetic field of a magnet depends on the magnetic domains within a ferromagnet, but the field as a whole has a kind of organizing capacity. It structures the space around it. So it's a field phenomenon. And how morphic fields work is by imposing order or pattern on otherwise indeterminate systems. That's my own interpretation. So I think the morphic fields that underlie our thoughts and the way in which our minds interact with our brains are by imposing patterns on otherwise indeterminate processes. Now, if you had analog computers that have genuine randomness within them, it's possible that morphic fields would actually emerge and get a grip on the pattern, and they become truly self-organizing and, in a sense, alive. But that's not the kind we've got. It's possible that quantum computers, which are actually very like analog computers in a way, it's possible quantum computers where there is genuine randomness, at the quantum level everyone knows there's this indeterminism, it's possible that quantum computers will become like what I'm saying about analog computers, and then the question might really arise as to whether they can come to life and have a self-organizing property in a way that I don't think digital computers ever will have. Well, I've seen various outputs from artificial intelligence. People have sent me, I haven't done it myself, but people have sent me things where they ask questions about how might morphic resonance affect the evolution of the universe, something like that. And it comes up with a fairly plausible way of doing it. And since most people don't spend much time thinking about morphic resonance, the evolution of the universe, this is not just copying it from some website. It's coming up with new combinations of information. It can combine information in novel ways, but it always has to have the input, massive amount of data in order to be able to do this. So it's still combining and using inputs. Whether a computer would be able to come up with a genuinely new idea or new theory, I don't know. I mean, some new theories involve just recombining what's already there, but sometimes completely new theories are not recombining what's already there. I mean, in biology, a lot of evolution is, modifying, a bit, an animal can be a bit longer, a bit shorter. The legs in dogs, you can have long legs in greyhounds, short legs in dachshunds and stuff. A lot of biological evolution involves modifying, quantitative modification of structures. But the really interesting and difficult to explain parts of biological evolution, where you get something completely new, the eye when there was no eye before, or feathers when there were no feathers before. And those kind of jumps, creative jumps, new kinds of wholeness, are the most radical kinds of creativity. I haven't seen anything that makes me think AI would do that. It sort of combines, for example, the idea of morphic resonance with cosmology, or morphic resonance with human ideas, or morphic resonance with games or something, but it's putting together and making new combinations of existing things. And intelligence is not just about that. That's one of the functions of intelligence, making new combinations. But there's also this leap to a new level. A creative leap involves a new kind of wholeness, a new pattern of wholeness. And I don't think AI could possibly do that, because I don't think it has an intrinsic wholeness in its operating function. It's basically combining stuff. So anyway, I think it's most unlikely. I'd even be prepared to bet. But then you get into sort of arguments about, well, how do you actually decide whether this has happened or not? Anyway, that's my own view.
We're seeing a lot of talk right now about agency. There are many different plugins and ways of interacting with GPT-4 with what I call looping scripts, that a human gives it a task and then it loops through subtasks until it achieves that main task. This is not true autonomy or agency, but I wonder if we could get there. And I noted to Rupert that these models are essentially frozen. For something like GPT-4, it's locked all the way back in September 2021 with its end of data, and it can't learn from there. It's locked in time, it's frozen in time. So how could it have a sense of agency? It probably couldn't. In the future, I wondered, from a biological view, could AI have a sense of agency? Could it be agentic?
I'm sure it can simulate making its own decisions. I don't think there's any problem with that. You can easily, I can think of ways you could program it to apparently make its own decisions, but basically it's not a self-organizing system. Self-organizing systems have their own intentions and goals, which are survival and reproduction in the case of most biological systems. You could, I suppose, program it to have goals of one kind or another and become more proactive. But I still think you'd have to program it to do that. And you could put in all these possibilities and then let it choose, and then some randomized pseudo-randomizing system where it would suddenly have this intention that was already possible, but then it would be actualized and it would give the impression of having an intention spontaneously. You could do all that, but I don't think it would change the basic argument.
More than a decade ago, in 2012, a group of experts gave us the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. Now, it was focused on declaring consciousness for animals. So it pointed out that the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. But I wanted to get Rupert's view on this.
It seemed to me kind of somewhat ponderous and slow. Here's this declaration by all these animal scientists who spent ages in seminar rooms discussing if animals can actually feel and be sentient and stuff. And, if you've kept a dog or a cat, you don't need to have hours in seminar rooms discussing it. You just know that they can. And so it's in a sense, that declaration is a step in the right direction, because what it says is that animals can feel and can have a sentient being and subjectivity and stuff. Well, the reason it's important in science is because since the time of Descartes in the 17th century, science has treated animals as mere unconscious, inanimate machines. Now, that's so counterintuitive that a lot of people never believed it anyway, and most people who've worked with horses or dogs or cats or keep animals have never believed it. It's a kind of artificial view, and the Cambridge Declaration on Animal Sentience is, saying, well, actually, if you look at the scientific data, it looks as if they really do have sentience, emotions, etc., etc. So in a sense, it's like science ponderously catching up with what's common sense for most people, and certainly most traditional cultures. I mean, I can't think of a single traditional culture where they've thought of animals as being inanimate machines, and no one in Europe thought that way till the 17th century, and even now, the majority don't think that way, because they keep dogs or cats or watch wild birds or are interested in animal life or watch David Attenborough. And the message that comes across from all those wildlife films that are so popular here in Britain, natural history films, it's certainly not, these are machines. So anyway, I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think we need the permission of the Cambridge Declaration to take seriously the life and sentience of animals. If you look at it in its historical context, animals are machines, yet the Cambridge Declaration tells us they have sentience. Computers are machines, so by analogy, maybe they could have sentience. But you see, I think what's false in this whole argument is the idea that animals are machines in the first place. So the analogy breaks down. And, I think there's a lot of muddled thinking in this area, because people say, well, look, we're basically machines, our brain's just a computer, and so if we can show that artificial intelligence really exists in machines, it will actually prove that our brain's just a computer and that we're machines. The ultimate goal of many mechanists and mechanistic materialists is to prove that we're machines without free will, and artificial intelligence for them is a useful argument along this path to deprive us of any sense of us being not machines. It's blurring the distinction. And since they think we're machines without free will, artificial intelligence fits that model quite well. But if you don't start from the machine assumption, then the argument looks quite different.
In 2022 and 2023, there was a lot of research going on about how large language models compare to the human brain, and vice versa, how the human brain compares to large language models. You can go and read more about that at lifearchitect.ai/brain, and it's from all sorts of institutions, not just corporates, not just academics, but a bit of a mix between the two, and the findings are sensational. It's kind of confronting to see the fact that maybe LLMs, large language models, are a replica of the brain, or the other way around, but it's reducing humans a little bit, and I wanted to get Rupert's view on this particular point.
Basically, one of my own ideas, as you know, is morphic resonance, the idea there's a kind of direct connection across time based on similarity of vibratory patterns in self-organizing systems. So I think that morphic resonance, that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits, that each species has a kind of collective memory given by morphic resonance. And the shocking and perhaps counterintuitive view that I have, this theory has of normal memory, is that memory is not stored in the brain through modified synapses, DNA molecules, phosphorylated proteins or whatever, physical memory traces. Instead, it depends on a resonance from the past states of the brain, similar past states. So it's a resonance across time, and it's no more stored in the brain than a TV program is stored in in a TV set. The TV set is tuning in to invisible transmissions, which is where the information's coming from. So I think that in our own memories, we're tuning in by morphic resonance to our own past. And because we're similar to other people, we get also a more general memory, collective memory from others. So individual memory and collective memory differ in degree, but not in kind. And so the memory involved in our own brains is not based on sort of little nodes of changes in chips, inside chips that give the memory as a physical memory trace, as it does in a computer or in an artificial neural network. Instead, our memory works holistically via a kind of resonance with what's happened in the past. So I think our minds work so differently from computers that these seeming analogies and attempts to provide ever more reductive analogies and reduce our minds to computers, our own intelligence to artificial intelligence inside computer-like brains, is completely misconceived. And I think if we want genuine artificial intelligence, it's not going to emerge in any of these deterministic systems, as I was saying earlier. It might emerge in analog models where there's a genuine morphic field. It can emerge a self-organizing field. And those models would then have as a bonus extra the ability to resonate with similar computers all around the world, and you have a kind of collective memory system without the need for hard drives and sort of chips and flash drives and stuff. It work on completely different principles. So I think that the artificial intelligence and neural networks simulate some aspects of our own mental activity, but I think they're so fundamentally different in the way they work that they're not really going to illuminate very much the nature of consciousness or sentience. But I think if we're going to think about AI and minds, then we have to have a view of the mind that goes beyond the narrow mechanistic materialist view of the mind is the activity of the brain and the brain's a computer. Minds, we already know, are so much more than that. And so we have to have a broader view of mind if we're going to have, including what I was saying earlier about panpsychism, minds that aren't based in brains, other kinds of minds in the universe. Then I think we'd have a much broader context for the discussion, but right now it's sort of cramped into this brain as a computer model and deterministic, materialistic ways of thinking. So those are all the reasons for my skepticism about it.
Dr. Rupert Sheldrake as a skeptic. This one was new to me because you may know that Dr. Rupert has faced a lot of opposition through his life. Professor Richard Dawkins spent a lot of time talking about the God delusion and then trying to override what Dr. Rupert was doing, which is a little bit strange. And then the late James Randi, of course, who spent a lot of his life also trying to poke holes in these sensational theories of what has come about from the study of life and consciousness.
No, I am a skeptic, actually. My book, The Science Delusion, is an exercise in radical skepticism. I think most skeptics, or so-called skeptics, are people who use skepticism to defend established orthodox scientific views by pouring sort of extreme skepticism onto anything that goes against it. I mean, this is a technique that's used by skeptics of all kinds, climate change skeptics, vaccine skeptics, and skeptics of environmental regulation. They're hired by mainly US corporations to challenge the science on which there are environmental regulations, pointing out that why can you set an arbitrary limit for how much pollution there can be? It can't be an arbitrary, the science is messy, it could be this or that, so we can't have any regulations till there's more precise science, which will take another 20 or 30 years, so the corporation can go on polluting unchecked. You know, there's a whole product defense lawyers, there's a higher industry of this kind of professional skepticism. But it's all usually in defense of a particular orthodoxy or interest. Radical skepticism involves looking at the belief system itself. So a radical skepticism about mechanistic science, as I try to show in my book, The Science Delusion, looks at the 10 main dogmas of science and turns them into questions. And is the mind nothing but the activity of the brain? Are memories stored in brains instead of memories are stored in brains as physical traces? It becomes a question, and when you ask the question, it opens the whole subject up. So I think radical skepticism we definitely need, and I certainly think of myself as a radical skeptic, as opposed to the conservative skeptics who are basically trying to defend the status quo.
A real privilege to sit with Rupert here and discuss biology, consciousness, and AI. I love the fact that we didn't really come to a conclusion, but he certainly opened up the discussion. Rupert's always been very kind to me. I sat with him in his home in Hampstead, or maybe 2017, 2018, and some of that interview appeared in my book, Connected. Do have a look at his website, sheldrake.org. Do have a look at his YouTube videos and some of the amazing content that he puts out to detail his different research that is still going on. An incredibly prolific man, 80 years old, just about to turn 81, and still publishing, still creating new thought experiments, still running new projects. Fascinating. I love the fact that we don't particularly have a real conclusion today, that we've just explored this concept of AI and consciousness. I will take him up on his bet, because I think that AI may be able to become conscious, that we could have this thing, even though it's embedded in silicon, maybe it's embedded in organic matter, but I think this is going to be ramping up quicker than we expect, and this conversation is going to get louder and louder and louder. Thanks so much for joining me. See you soon.
Did you see the memo about this?
Yeah. I have the memo right here.
Readying yourself and your family for integrated AI? Get the #1 paid AI newsletter, Artificial Intelligence That Matters, as it happens in plain English.
Did you get that memo?
Yeah, I got the memo.
Join readers from Microsoft, Google, DeepMind, and government.
Yeah, didn't you get that memo?
Lifearchitect.ai/memo.
I have the memo.